Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Truth Seeker here. As you can see, it's not the most beautiful of days. It's a little on the dark side, but it is at least mild. And the kids next door had an Easter egg hunt, and we're going to have an Easter egg hunt tomorrow for my grandson. Hide eggs around the yard and watch him as he finds a year's worth of candy he probably shouldn't be eating. But it's fun. Kids have a great time. If you watch in the background, you may get to see an osprey or a bald eagle. They've been out today fishing. As I was setting up, there was an osprey that had just caught a fish and was making off with it. So if you see an eagle or an osprey behind me, don't be surprised. Beautiful birds. But yes, this is Easter season. Yesterday, the Jehovah's Witnesses celebrated their memorial. The Bible students celebrated their memorial on Thursday evening. I don't know why there's a difference. I guess they pick, I don't know, different dates when the moon or something comes out. I guess they base it on the lunar year, which is what the ancient Jews based their year from. But all this talk, a couple of videos have been made about the memorial, and it just brought back so many memories to me about the memorial as a kid. Most times, you see, my dad grew up in Florida, and my family was in Florida, even though we lived in New York. We rarely celebrated the memorial in the New York class. We would be down in Orlando with my grandparents. Back in those days, schools closed for 2 weeks for Easter holiday. Today, they don't do that. They have spring break, usually in March. Some schools have had it as recently as a couple of weeks ago. My daughter was off last week. She's a teacher. And but they don't get the 2 weeks like we used to get. There used to be 2 weeks at Christmas and 2 weeks at Easter. People paid more attention to the religious holidays when I was growing up. You saw more kids on Ash Wednesday with the little black smudge or gray smudge on their forehead and carrying a palm leaf. The area I grew up in was very cosmopolitan because of New York City. There was a great exodus out of the city, so we had a great mixture of faiths in my school. There were quite a few Catholics. There were quite a few Jewish kids in the schools that I went to. A lot of Protestants. We had a Grace Baptist Church. Most of the kids in my neighborhood went to Grace Baptist Church, but there were a few Catholics that lived on the street, and we'd get the little gray smudge on their forehead on Good Friday. No, Ash Wednesday, I'm sorry. I don't know about these things. I was never Catholic. But, yeah, Ash Wednesday. And then there was Lent and all that other stuff. I never did understand Catholic religion very well. It was mostly about ceremony and pomp and circumstances as much as anything else. But we would be in Florida, and I remember because my grandparents held the meeting in their home. Now, we always stayed at their home. They had a nice back in the 50s. There were a lot of developments down in Florida in the Orlando region that this is pre-Disney that were made of cement block building. I guess that was a building material that lasted longer in the Florida climate than wood. Wood would rot very easily in the subtropical climate, and so a lot of homes were one story without a basement on a slab, and they were made out of cement block, and they had flat roofs with a stone roof on it. Then they had an open carport with a roof over it, and they had a little utility room right off the edge of the garage. And then the main house was basically a 3-bedroom home that they had. They expanded it a bit, but one room was one very, very small bedroom was used as my grandfather's office as an elder. Was his study room. Then they had a guest bedroom, which was pretty large, and then they had their bedroom, my grandparents' bedroom, which had a bath off of it. And then there was the main bath. There was a large living room where the Hammond organ was, and then they had it was sort of a kitchen, dining room, rec room combination. It was a very long room, and that's where they had their television set. I remember they had one of the first color TV sets from RCA. It had a round video screen, and off of the kitchen, they had a dining room table. That's where they ate. So it was a kitchen dining room area, and then they had couches and bookshelf, and it was sort of a den TV area further down. It was all one long room, multi-purpose room. And then off to the back side and toward the backyard, my grandfather built a closed-in, screened-in porch with a cement floor. And his backyard was loaded with every kind of fruit tree you could possibly think of. And we kids used to enjoy going there because it was warm, it was different. My parents weren't watching us. They didn't watch us much anyway, but we felt a little bit more freedom down there, and we had my cousins that we would visit, and that was generally exciting for me because I didn't get to see family very much because my dad's family. My dad was the second oldest in the family. He had 3 other siblings, and they scattered across the country. My aunt, my dad's oldest sister, married a fellow in San Diego, and they had a large family. There were 5 of them. One of my cousins passed away when a very young age, but I think there was some kind of a congenital disorder that caused his death. And then there were the other 5. Yep, 5, and my aunt and uncle. And that was my dad's oldest sister. She was the oldest in the family, and also the last of my dad's siblings to pass away. Then there was my dad, who was second, and he moved to New York. And then my uncle, he stayed in Orlando near my grandparents, and my aunt, my dad's youngest sister, moved to Michigan. and so my family was scattered all over the place. On occasion, we would get together down in Florida. There would be family reunions of sorts, but we never did have the entire family together. I don't know why, but my family didn't seem to have as much. I don't know. Maybe it was because we were all Bible students. We didn't think, that the family was quite as special. When I got older, I tried to get them all together because we were always together at the General Convention, and I always tried to get the family together at least one night so that we could spend time together as a family. Um, I'm not sure how much they really appreciated doing that, but I kind of forced the issue, and until the family basically, when my grandparents passed away, both of them in the same year, 1978, we essentially stopped doing that. Um, but memorials were always held down in Florida for us because we were visiting my grandparents, and we had 2 weeks vacation at school. And I remember Grandma making a big deal about it because Memorial usually fell on some non-Sunday evening. It was usually some day during the week, and she would spend an entire day getting everything ready. She would get the podium up ready for the speaker. There would be 30 or 35 or so that would attend the memorial then. The Orlando class was, relatively speaking, a small class in those days. Um, the She would set up all the folding chairs. She had all these steel folding chairs, and she'd set them up, and she set up the podium with the cross and crown, I guess, embroidered. I don't know what you call those things. They hang, they're insignias that had the cross and crown embroidered on them, flag, or well, I don't know what you call it. And then that was hung off the podium, and then there was. She would go shopping the night before and get the grape juice. They didn't use wine. My family was very anti-alcohol, and so they used grape juice and matzah. She would get the matzah, and she would break the matzah up and put it all out on the trays. She had these little special trays that she had specially dedicated to the memorial, and she had these little shot glasses that they were dedicated to the memorial, and she would put them into the. She would have all the shot glasses on the tray, and she had a white napkin covering the tray, and there was a little table up in the front of the podium that had a white tablecloth on it, and she would set up the trays with the broken up matzah on it, covered with a white napkin up on the table, along with the shot glasses with the grape juice in it, and she would set it all up with one cup in the middle that was large. I don't know why they did that. There was always somebody who always drank from the large cup. I don't know. Maybe they were extra consecrated or something. I don't know. But the way we celebrated the memorial, it was instilled in us that it was a very reverential thing, that it was a very special night, that we were to take it much more seriously than meetings, and meetings were serious. They were not. They were not. They were not something to. You had to really mind your manners in a meeting. Well, especially so during the memorial, because the memorial was the annual celebration of the Lord's giving His life. Now, the whole thing was based in the whole celebration or ceremony. It really was a ceremony. Was based in the practice established by Charles Taze Russell and the early Bible students. And because most Bible students believed that they were running for the prize of the high calling, um, in other words, they believed they were of the anointed class or of the 144,000, which was taken to be literal, that there were only out of all of the Christians, so-called Christians from the time of Jesus to the present time, there were only 144,000 individuals who would get the privilege of going to heaven. The problem with that is that in the teaching, Russell taught that the 144,000 were resurrected. I guess it's in Romans. If we die in the likeness of his death, I think it's Romans 5. We'll be resurrected in the likeness of his resurrection, and he's talking about Jesus, and Jesus was resurrected to the right hand of God, and there's a scripture in 2 Peter where it talks about that the hope of the church or of the anointed class was the divine nature, and Russell interpreted the divine nature to be death proof. That once God chose one to be of the 144,000 and resurrects them to the heavenly plane, they were made to be like him. That they were death proof, that they were all powerful, all knowing, and so the way it was put was that God was making a family. The 144,000 were the special or peculiar people that would be the family of God. And they would be the kings and the priests that would rule over the earth. And they were chosen from the earth because they could be merciful high priests during the 1,000-year kingdom. And so there would be no thing that humans would experience that the church itself hadn't at least empathy or sympathy for, and they could be a good high priest. That's the way it was sold. The problem with that is that also at the same time, God was always supposed to be omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent and everything else all at once. And if the church were resurrected to that same plane, to that same level, then God no longer really is omnipotent, and he better choose wisely, because it's like that Indiana Jones, where the old Crusade Knights Templar in the Last Crusade, the movie The Last Crusade, he tells Indiana Jones, choose wisely. And if God didn't choose wisely, he can't undo what he did, because they're death proof. And so that was always something that bothered me as a kid growing up, that there was this paradox that was created by this notion of the divine nature. But of course, all of this hinged upon one single doctrine, and the doctrine was the doctrine of the ransom. And the ransom was that Jesus was a sacrifice, an atonement for sin. And it wasn't just for the church, but he was an atonement for all of the world. You see, as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. In other words, the way Russell interpreted the ransom. And in fact, he really took this very seriously because he made a break with Nelson Barber early on in his ministry over this doctrine of the ransom, where Barber did not believe that Jesus was a substitution for Adam, and that caused a lot of months and months of infighting between Barber and Nelson Barber and Russell. In the they would exchange nasty grams in their Morning Herald um, magazine that they printed jointly. They were both editors in the masthead, and Russell really took exception to Barber and vice versa. And within a couple years of their association, even though much of the chronology and many of the doctrines that Russell obtained came through Barber and others like George Storrs and George Stetson and others that studied with Russell. Russell wasn't a very original theologian. Basically, he just kind of picked and chose what he felt was reasonable from other doctrines, other teachings, other people's teaching, and he kind of all mashed them together into the Bible students' doctrines. And despite the close association that Barber had with Russell, they broke in 1879, and Russell stopped funding Barber, who had no money of his own, and began publishing the Zion's Watchtower in July of 1879. And in a very short period, there were 30 or so classes that were formed in the Northeast around the Allegheny class, and that's where things began with the Bible students movement. And they tried to celebrate the memorial based on the ransom. Now they used Luke and Matthew as the basis scriptures for the celebrating the memorial. They would celebrate Jesus was celebrating the Passover, and then he established the memorial, where after they celebrated the Passover, he then took the cup and he blessed it, and he said, drink this, and this is my blood of the new covenant, and do this in remembrance of me. And there was a segment in there where he talks about, drink ye all of it, and there was always the argument as to whether or not he meant drink all of the juice or all of you partake of it. There was always that discussion that happened every year, because we always had memorial studies every year before about a month or two before the memorial itself, in preparation of the memorial. And then he would bless the bread and pass the bread around and said, "This is my body, take, eat." And the bread represented and the bread and the blood represented his body and his life that he gave in ransom sacrifice for Adam. And as the scripture in Corinthians 15 says, "As in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive, but every man in his own order." And they took that very literally, that Jesus' sacrifice was a substitute for Adam's transgression. Well, there's no judge in the world that would accept a substitutionary justice. We don't believe that that's justice. The Mosaic law is kind of the way justice is meted out, an eye for an eye. But if somebody committed the crime, it's that person that must pay for the crime. Somebody else can't pay for them uh, for the crime that they committed. They themselves have to pay for the crime. And supposedly or allegedly, Adam made a criminal act, which I don't understand, because when you read the Genesis account, apparently there were these different trees in the Garden of Eden, and you had the tree of life, and you had all these other fruit trees in the garden, in the way it's interpreted and the way it's described in Genesis. And there were these special trees in the garden. One was the tree of life, where if you partake of the tree, you live forever. And apparently Adam never partook of that tree. Maybe he didn't know what that tree was, because after they had sinned, quote unquote sinned, he and Eve, God was worried that they partake of that tree and live forever. And so there were guards, angels which wielded fiery swords, prevented Adam and Eve from re-entering the garden once they were expelled from Eden, so that they couldn't partake of the tree of life. If they had taken of that tree of life, then the sentence of death wouldn't have had any meaning, because they would have lived forever. So they apparently did not partake of this tree of life. Um, otherwise, there wouldn't be any kind of an issue at all. uh, but it implies that humans were destined to live forever. But there are a couple things that don't make sense. The other special tree that's mentioned in the garden is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now that is really quite interesting, and it's quite substantial when you stop and you think about it, because this means that God created Adam and Eve without an understanding of right and wrong. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. If they didn't know, if this tree opened up their eyes to what was right and what was wrong, what was good and what was evil, they didn't have this moral sense as an innate trait. So, in essence, no matter despite the warning that God gave about not partaking of that tree, and they weren't supposed to partake of that tree, the they would have gone on living, but they wouldn't have had any understanding of what was right and wrong. And without a sense, a moral sense, or a sense of judgment of what's right or what's wrong, they wouldn't have been any different than any other animal. Now, think about it. Now, he may have obeyed. Let's look at it this way. Let's say Adam obeyed. Let's say both of them obeyed this warning. You can train a puppy to not pee on a rug, but it will never understand why it shouldn't pee on the rug. You can punish it, and it will not understand. It just realizes and makes the association that if it does pee on the rug, it's going to get a swat. I guess I don't know. I guess people train puppies differently nowadays. I don't know. I know that when I was growing up, my mother used to swat the dog with a rolled up newspaper when it peed on the rug. The dog never really understood why. It just learned that if it did, it would respond. But there was no understanding behind it. And humans wouldn't have been any different. There wouldn't have been any reason for their behavior. There wouldn't have been a choice between doing good and doing wrong, and in a meaningful way, because they would have lacked this inherent understanding. They wouldn't have had this moral sense, and so not having this moral sense, they wouldn't have understood why it was wrong. Like the puppy who pees on the floor, they wouldn't have understood why it was wrong that they ate the fruit. And here is this caretaker that was put in charge over them in the garden, who's saying, hey, this is a good thing. You'll have your eyes open. You'll be like the gods. Which I'm not sure how that they could have had such a communication, because I think the moral sense is so important in human beings that you really can't understand unless you had this greater sense of values, of what is right and what is wrong. And so, was it right for God to punish them? How could they be punished for life by disobedience when they didn't really understand what disobedience meant? That's unfair. I mean, that's a terrible thing. That's a tremendously wrong thing. If there was a God like that, and then to punish them and to subject them to and their progeny to conditions of sin and sickness and now the Bible students have an answer for that. They say, well, God did it for the good of humanity, and that humankind is learning. This is what we call the permission of evil. That for 6,000 years, the worst atrocities that could be imaginable are permitted to come upon the human race, because they'll learn something from it, and then they will never. They will have it so deeply imprinted in their heart that when the kingdom comes and humankind is restored to original perfection because of the ransom sacrifice of Jesus, which applied to ransom a perfect man's life for a perfect man's life, then Adam is redeemed. He's freed from the sin that he really didn't understand he was committing, and which goes against what Paul has to say, because Paul says Eve didn't understand what she was doing, but Adam did. But Adam didn't have the knowledge of good and evil, so Paul is wrong in Timothy, where he says that Adam understood. You see, there's so many contradictions in doctrine and the way the Bible students interpret the Bible. But anyway, if this thousands and thousands of years of horrific experience for humans and for the greater part of human experience that we understand, it's been a pretty tough struggle. Um, the pain and the suffering that the humankind has had to endure. How could a loving God not have found a better way? I mean, geez. Supposedly, man is created a little lower than the angels, and what they mean is, if God says, "Let us reason together," He made us in His image, according to the Bible. Then we should have been able to understand without having to undergo this experience. And supposedly, when the 1,000 years is done and humankind is restored back to perfection, there's going to be forever in the future, supposedly after the end of the little season, there's going to be forever in the future where there will be no more sin, there will be no more permission of evil, and humans, whoever comes into being, I mean, it's a pretty darn big universe. Did God just leave that universe not to be populated? Then they will have to learn some other way. So why then did this lesson have to be made with this group of humans that live from Adam on down to the kingdom and the restoration? God should have been able, if He was omniscient and omnipotent, to find a better way. I mean, after all, the angels didn't have a savior, according to the Bible, and humans are not entirely too different from the angels. Apparently, they were close enough to be able to interbreed before the flood. You see, this is why trying to make sense of the Bible just is so darn problematic. I mean, even the book of Genesis itself. I mean, I've made videos in the past about this, but in the first chapter of Genesis, where it talks about creation, if God were the author of the Bible, at least what we know today in science, if the Bible were in fact the Word of God, would be consistent. What the things that are said in Genesis about the creative process would be consistent with what we know to be fact in science, in the scientific world, about how the Earth came to be. And the big problem, the big one, is for Bible students, and the one for Charles Russell that was always the one that he had to address the most, was what he thought was his big problem, was the fourth creative day, where it said that God created the sun and the moon, the greater light that ruled the day and the lesser light that ruled the night, and He made the stars also. I went through this in previous videos, where the two words that are used in the creative context, the first chapter of Genesis, for made or create, are asa and bara. Asa is, if you look at the Strong's Concordance, is 6213, and bara is 1254, means to form or fashion, and 6213, asa, means to accomplish. And the way it's explained, in fact, the Jehovah's Witnesses still use this argument that the fourth creative day was the earth was enshrouded in clouds, and the atmosphere was so dense and so thick with clouds that some light penetrated enough to allow the plants to grow, because the plants were created on the third creative day. That the sun actually was in existence, from the very beginning, before the earth was made, and plants came into existence on the third creative day, and then the fourth creative day. It really doesn't mean, this is what Bible students say, that really doesn't mean that God created the sun and the moon and the stars on the fourth day. It's just that the atmosphere cleared up and they could become visible. Well, first off, become visible to whom? Okay, there weren't any people on the earth. There were no animals on the earth. So that it's actually a moot point. I mean, it's kind of meaningless to make that point, to make that as the main point of that work, if there wasn't anybody there to appreciate it. So from that aspect, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But mostly is to say that means you have to change the meaning of the word made, because in other words, you're saying that, by saying that the fourth creative day was when the sun and the moon and the stars came into appearance. Well, that's kind of like what the third creative day said about land. He said that God gathered the waters together and the dry land appeared. Well, that word, there's a word for appeared, and that word, I can't really pronounce it well, Wetera or Weteria, it's a strong 7200, and it means to appear, to be visible, to make visible. And so if that's what God meant for the fourth creative day, he would have used that word for the sun and the moon and the stars. But he didn't. He used the same word that he used in every creative sense, that God made the animals, and God made the fruit trees, and God made the sun, the moon, and the stars. That word asa and bara are both used in the context of accomplishing or being made or to create. And so you can't just change the meaning of the words. So that argument falls apart, especially when there's a word that was used in the previous scripture for the third creative day, when the land was made visible. Okay, it came to appear. So you can't say that that the sun and the moon and the stars, the atmosphere cleared up so that you could see them. That argument doesn't fly. And when it says when they, that they were made on the fourth day, that's what those words mean. The word asa means made or to accomplish. When man was made, it was asa. When the animals were made, it was asa. And so, and bara, both words were used interchangeably even. And so you can't just suddenly change the meaning of the words to fit what is convenient or a way to explain out a paradox or dilemma, because we know darn well that the earth was not created before the sun. We know that the sun was created about, created. It came into existence about 5 billion years ago, and the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And so we know these from scientific fact. And I'm not even going to argue those 6-day creationists. Those guys are so out there that they don't even warrant an argument. I'm trying to address those who are trying to make Genesis scientifically meaningful. Uh, you know, the only other thing that you can think of is that it's a metaphor, and that it's really a metaphor. But if it's a metaphor and it was God, wouldn't you think that God, who be consistent with what really happened in the creative days? Why would he? What would be the purpose behind getting everything all mixed up if it wasn't a metaphor? What would it mean? Why would that? Why would that be? For one thing, that's not the only problem we got with Genesis and the creative order. we got the fact that fish and birds were made on the fifth creative day. Well, we know that birds are descendants of dinosaurs, and that they're relatively recent in Earth history. When you talk about 4.5 billion years of Earth history, birds descended from dinosaurs in the Jurassic period. They first began, and we know that there's a close relationship to certain branches of dinosaur with the birds today. They're direct descendants of them, and there's increasing evidence of that all the time in the fossil record. And so it took the creation of very sophisticated animals that lived for hundreds of millions of years before birds ever came to be. So the order in which birds came to be is incorrect. And then on the third creative day, it talks about fruiting trees. Well, we know that flowering plants didn't come into being until sometime in the Cretaceous period. There were plants, yes, even before there were animals. There were plants, but the flowering trees, trees that reproduce sexually, flowers in themselves, and flowering trees that gave fruit didn't come into existence until around the Cretaceous period, which was relatively recent again in Earth history, 150 million to 65 million years ago. And so the order of the fruiting trees is wrong. So all of Genesis is really off when you compare it to what we know and understand scientifically. And so this whole idea of the Bible, having any veracity is very very dubious, to say the least. These are primitive men trying to find and grope their way to an understanding of things that they didn't understand. The world was a scary place. There was natural phenomena that took place that they didn't understand. Great floods. There were the great weather events, and primitive man didn't understand these things, and they had to try and rationalize and come up with some form of explanation for these things, because humans were developing a reasoning mind. We were trying to find answers to things, and the best thing that we could come up with at the time was that there were these beings that had greater power than us, and that they lived in a realm that transcended ours, and they had great power over us, and we called them the gods, and we had many different forms of gods. I think, now this is my own personal thing. I mean, look, Carl Sagan, he was a well-known, highly reputed astrophysicist and astronomer and educator He was one of the first cosmologists to try and reach the public to get them to understand how the universe came into being and the expanse of the universe. I mean, after all, um, this is, I mean, the Bible was written when people didn't think that there was much more than what we could see with our eyes, which, when we look up in the heavens, are a couple thousand stars that we can see visually, and we see the moon and the sun, and that's about it. You know, I mean, our world was very, very limited in scope. And so humans, it was natural for humans, primitive humans, to think that all we could see was all that there was. And it was a very terrifying and fearful world. Think about Rome. We were watching something about Caligula yesterday. And Caligula marched the Roman army. Now, there was nothing more fearsome, more terrifying, more brave, more audacious than the Roman soldiers, more proud of their audacity. They were never conquered. The Roman army conquered the known world, and Caligula, not having much more of the world that he knew of to conquer, marched he had spies up in Britain who were saying, "Hey, Britain is a prize. It's ready for the taking." And so Caligula marched a grand army up to the English Channel, and there they stopped. Now, they the story is that the soldiers were afraid that that was the end of the world. That was the edge of the world, and that if they had gone out into the sea, they would have gone over the edge and into their death. And so they decided that they were not going any further than the edge of the sea. And so Caligula, to humiliate them, had them picking up seashells on the seashore. And nothing more humiliating to a Roman soldier than to be reduced to picking up seashells. That was the ultimate insult. And so that was a fascinating idea. But these fearsome, they were willing to go to hand battle with anybody in the world to conquer the world, and they were afraid of going across that English Channel because they thought that that was the end of the world, the edge of the world. And so primitive humans had these ideas deeply ingrained, embedded in their heads, that this was it, that everything that we see was made with us in mind, and we are the entire scope. That was until Galileo pointed a telescope into the heavens. And from that moment on, our worldview changed. And now we know that the Milky Way galaxy, which up until this last century, we didn't think that the universe extended beyond the Milky Way. Can you think of that? In fact, that was when Einstein developed the theory of relativity, that he did that with the idea in mind. 1915. Here we're waging World War I. And in 1915, when he's working on the general theory of relativity, nobody thought that there was anything greater in the whole expanse of the entire universe was embodied, encompassed within the Milky Way galaxy. That was all there was, until Edwin Hubble in the 1920s with a powerful, powerful telescope, began to realize some of these fuzzy blotches in the sky were actually galaxies in their own right, and that these galaxies were moving away at vast rates of speed, and that they were redshifted away from us, that everything was Doppler shifted away. And today we now know from the Hubble telescope and other even more powerful telescopes that we have put into orbit around the Earth, that first off, that our Milky Way alone is one galaxy out of 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion galaxies, and that number's going up. This universe could be infinite as far as we understand. We don't know. There's a lot we don't know, but what we do know is that it transcends what humans understood in the Bible so much more than we could possibly even imagine. We can't even imagine 100 billion stars, and that's our own galaxy, and that there are 100 billion galaxies that we estimate exist, and that number is growing. And Andromeda, our closest neighboring galaxy, which is about 2 million light years away and in a collision course with us too. Both the Milky Way and Andromeda are going to meld together. Andromeda is even larger than the Milky Way and has about 1 trillion stars. 1 trillion stars. That's a 10 with 12 zeros behind it. So that's a phenomenal number. In the Milky Way alone, there are 100 billion estimated planets, 40% of which are Earth-like planets that they estimate. Right now, finding planets. I saw a figure for 2019 that there are 4,000 planets that they've identified, and 40% of those planets are Earth-like planets. Now, we don't need necessarily Earth-like planets to sustain life. There could be any variety of conditions that would sustain life, but we know that Earth-like planets do sustain life because we're here, and we know that evolution has taken place, and that's another thing. I mean, when you talk about the ransom. We know that, like any other creature on this planet, that we're a part of the natural order of this planet. We evolved into existence. The Homo sapiens are a very recent great ape that evolved, and we evolved to a very high order of intellect. And if it happens here on this planet, why couldn't it happen in the 1 or 2 or 3 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 of the 40 billion other Earth-like planets in this galaxy alone? And again, there are 100 billion galaxies, so how many Earth-like planets exist in this universe? We are just at the threshold of understanding this universe. Does the Bible make sense? Did God send his son? The whole idea of God sending his son as a ransom it was made with the idea in mind that we were that we were, the Bible is very anthrocentric, if you want to, anthropocentric, if you want a fancy word or something you want to make up. Human, centered around human beings. It's salvation. It's all about the salvation of humankind who erred in the beginning and caused us to require us a savior. And there are a lot of brands of Christianity that require you to accept Jesus as your savior. The Bible students are just one other form of fundamental Christian group that had tried to make sense of the Bible in a little different way than other Christians did. And but as struggle as they may, it 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 really can't cut it, because there's so much more information that we have today than even Russell had. I mean, his uh, photodrama of creation uh, wasn't even a viable alternative for understanding. He called it a religio-scientific presentation. And that I think he was a bit dishonest here. When you look at the photodrama of creation, he said that it was 4 parts, and that each part was equivalent to 1 year of college, and that the 4 parts were equivalent to 4 years or more. So he was saying that the 8-hour presentation was equal to 4 years of college education, and that's being a charlatan as far as I'm concerned. And that's inexcusable. And he doesn't even go on to take responsibility for it. He says some say that each part is equivalent to a college education, 1 year of college education. But if he didn't believe it, why then say it? Why go out on a limb and say it? He was trying to lure people in. And even then, this veil theory that he used as the basis, as the backbone of his photodrama of creation, the religio-scientific explanation of creation, and was based on a theory that wasn't even accepted by. He was a crank. Isaac Vail, in 1870s crank, a Quaker school teacher, who tried to come up with a way for creation that would be consistent with the Bible. And that's where they get this fourth creative day being cloudy and all that. It was Vail's theory that the earth was ringed, that there were rings around the earth, and blocked out a vision of the universe, and so we couldn't see the sun and the moon and the stars. That's where all that came from. But it's awful hard to get away from the fact that humans are just a natural part of the way life came to be on this planet. It's an evolutionary process, and we evolved into being. Homo sapiens evolved into being as every other creature evolved into its existence today, and evolution is continuing. It's a process that continues on, and it's hard to think. And Carl Sagan was a proponent of this idea that with the billions and billions of stars, that there have to be other creations, other races, other beings of high intelligence and living and throughout the universe. They're peppered throughout the universe. And we may never, ever get to meet any of these other beings, but they're there. They're there. And, I suspect that evolution is a universal principle, that life begins in a simple form and evolves to the more complex. I don't think that Earth is exceptional in that way. I don't see why we would believe that Earth is exceptional that way. That it makes sense that that's the way life comes to be when life does come to existence in other places in the universe. And so maybe creating deities in our minds is also a natural part of the human or intellectual experience, because coming from a simpler uh, form. I don't think that it's just natural for creatures becoming sentient and becoming, gaining intellectual capacity and sorting out the world around them are going to jump right to the scientific method. It took humans hundreds of thousands of years to get to the point of Galileo and Isaac Newton. And even those guys didn't just jump right into the scientific method. It took 100 or 200 years before the scientific method was refined to the point where we're making outstanding accomplishments in just our iPhone. The physics in the devices that comprise our iPhones is mind-boggling. It's quantum mechanics. It's I studied physics in college. That was my major, and especially microelectronic device fabrication. And quantum mechanics is the key element to what makes a transistor work, a diode work, a light emitting laser, a light emitting diode work. And it's all quantum theory. Lasers work on the basis of quantum theory and pumping. And it's 100 years ago, we didn't understand quantum theory. There was no quantum mechanics. And so, in a very, very short space of time compared to the hundreds of thousands of years that Homo sapiens have been on the earth and chipping fine rocks, were we able to come up with a philosophical approach, the scientific method, that leads us to astounding knowledge, mind-boggling knowledge. And I believe this may be true with all creation. I call them creation, but they're all beings that come into existence throughout the universe, because there's no question they're there. Some may understand the physics of our universe to a far greater degree than we do. There could be beings that have existed for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, longer than our race of beings. And I think it's just a natural process to go through a phase. It's like children go through phases, when you have a new being that is just getting to understand the world around them. They're going to resort to this idea of deities. I think it's just a natural process to think that there will always be a religious phase to beings that come into existence, no matter where they are in the universe, but that we outgrow it if we don't destroy ourselves first. If we can get over the clinging doggedly to the idea that the earth is a temporary place, that God, it's a way station, and that it's a disposable way station, and that humanity's destiny is up in the heavens somewhere playing harps. That's a dangerous way of thinking about the earth, because then we don't take care of the earth. We're not, and we see how we can destroy ecosystems, how delicately balanced ecosystems are, and that if we don't watch what we're doing, if we don't control the population, runaway growth, that the Earth's resources are going to run out on us, and many species will become extinct, and we could even drive ourselves into extinction. We have to abandon old and outdated, outmoded concepts, and religion is one of them. And Christopher Hitchens always said that religion was a dangerous thing, and he was right. But it blocks us from advancing. It blocks us from getting a better and more responsible position in the world. I mean, we are creatures that make a difference in the world, and you know our impact right now is not is a negative one. Is one that is going to lead to another great extinction unless we put in controls on our own selves, and those controls really have a lot to do with staying within the parameters and the ability of this planet to be able to sustain us in a reasonable way, and without destroying the resources of this planet. It can happen. But anyway, this is a long video. But I don't know. There's so many things. The idea of that the Bible students is still holding on to this idea that God's going to save the world for us, and we have to outgrow. It's time for us to outgrow those old notions, those outmoded, those outdated, those extinct. They really should be extinct notions. They just don't serve us well. I mean, when there were only 100,000 humans on the earth, having these ideas really didn't pose a danger to the world. But now it does, when there's 7.5 billion of us, and the capacity of the planet may be 10 billion people. We're approaching that capacity very rapidly, and we need to do something about it. And we have to. Religion is not the answer. My parents said, "Oh, poor George, he needs the kingdom so badly," and they didn't intervene in his life, and they could have made a difference to him, but they deferred. They deferred because it was easy for them to give up on my brother, and he ended up living a catastrophic life, and he took his own life for it. We can't defer to the future, to something that we know is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And we've got to do our part to see that there's a future for our future generation. I have a grandson. I want him to be able to live in a good world, and have a good life and opportunities, and to appreciate this wondrous planet, and the life, that the diversity of life that we now enjoy. I don't want him to read a book that elephants used to exist and cheetahs used to exist, and what kind of a world would that be? It would be awful. It would be a shame. We have to put away those. It's funny. The Apostle Paul said, when I was a child, I thought childish things. Well, that's exactly what we're doing here. What we need to do. We need to put away our immature history. We're growing up as a race of beings. We're growing up. We're no longer the beings that don't understand that lightning is being thrown down by Thor or Jupiter, but that there's natural reasons, physical phenomena, physical reasons that are behind these things. We know that today. We have to dispel those old ideas, because those old ideas now pose a huge danger for us all. So anyway, I've finished with my rant. I'm sorry about that. But this is something that I feel very passionate about, and I think is very important. So anyway, I wish you all a very good Easter. Don't eat too much chocolate, and so long, everyone.